This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Spooky season. It's in full swing, and here at Where We Live, we're pretty much obsessed with all things scary, from sci-fi to horror. And as listeners know, we're also obsessed with all things reading. So, of course, we just had to dedicate a whole hour to spooky reads. So here's the big question today. When you think of horror, what comes to mind? Maybe the classics like Frankenstein, Dracula, or The Shining. Like many genres, horror has evolved with the times to encompass all things terrifying. So today, Where We Live is zombifying into Where We Read, and we explore our favorite spooky stories from today and yesterday. Joining us now is Andrew Liptek, author of the newsletter The Transfer Orbit, a newsletter about science fiction, writing, and the future. Andrew, welcome back to Where We Live.
Thanks for having me.
And joining us on Where We Live for the first time is Stephanie Gagne, host of the Books in the Freezer podcast. Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And also joining us is Jane Frankel. She's a librarian at the Warehouse Point Library in East Windsor, and also the author of a new short story called The Android. You can read her story in the 2025 Connecticut Literary Anthology. Thank you so much, Jane, for being with us today.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
And for our listeners, got a horror, thriller, sci-fi, or paranormal favorite to recommend? We would love to hear from you and give us your book recs, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So Stephanie, I want to start with you here. You are a die-hard horror fiction fan. Where did your interest in horror first begin?
I think for me, I'm a millennial, so I think in the 90s it was prime time for Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark? I watched The X-Files. I just felt like horror was everywhere. And I was a bit of a scaredy cat as a kid. And I found that reading horror just gave me a safe place to explore those fears. And then I just kind of became addicted to it.
I was a Fear Street reader, so that was definitely that was quite the era to grow up in, with all of the sort of classics now that we're talking about. So can you tell us a little bit more about your podcast?
Sure. It's a book recommendation podcast. So the way it's set up is that the episodes are usually about a specific topic or subgenre of horror, like road trip horror or possession horror. And I and a guest, sometimes an author, will each recommend 3 books under that topic. And it's called Books in the Freezer because it's a Friends reference. There's an episode of Friends where Rachel finds Joey's copy of The Shining in the freezer, and he says that he put it there because it was too scary. So that's the scale for scariness that we use when recommending books. Like if books are really scary, we say it's a freezer book that goes right in the freezer, or their fridge or room temperature. And that's not a quality scale. That's like, how scared was I when reading it?
No, that's like the most perfect scale ever. We're going to hear a quick clip from Books in the Freezer.
Why do you have a copy of The Shining in your freezer?
Oh, I was reading it last night and I got scared. So.
But you're safe from it if it's in the freezer?
Well, safer. I never start reading The Shining without making sure we got plenty of room in the freezer.
Right, just to give everyone a glimpse of what that meant by what Stephanie was describing. I can see that image very clearly in my head, actually. And you mentioned earlier that you felt like you were a little bit of a scaredy cat, and I feel like a lot of people can relate to that growing up. So tell us more about how reading horror actually helped you start to work through some of your fears.
I think just the act of reading these stories and allowing myself to be immersed in them, it's a catharsis. Like the minute that I was done reading it, it felt like an accomplishment. Like I put myself through something and I survived. I came out alive. And you're also reading stories about, at this point, like Goosebumps, like kids being in scary situations and coming out the other side. So
Well, we were kind of joking that we're going to start putting our laptops in the freezer because that's where a lot of the horror stories are coming from these days. And Andrew, you currently do write a newsletter dedicated to sci-fi, but it also includes some spooky, scary stuff too. So could you respond to what we just heard from Stephanie? How did you first get interested in these genres?
Yeah, I mean, I'd actually completely forgotten about Goosebumps until you mentioned it, but I did read a lot of those when I was a kid. I was never much of a horror fan, as a younger reader. What really kicked it off for me was I took a Gothic lit course in college. My professor, F. Brett Cox, is also a horror writer and science fiction writer. And it was a survey of the genre. So he went all the way back to American colonial times. And we read things like Nathaniel Hawthorne, a bit of Herman Melville, and then just sort of went up the timeline to, of the big names. So H.P. Lovecraft, Shirley Jackson, Stephen King. And I think it's been a while, but I think the last book we read was Joe Hill's collection, 20th Century Ghost, which I think it's its 20th anniversary this year, which makes me feel super old. And it was like I had really just always sort of not been interested in it. And in this course really just unlocked, like, this is what horror is about. It's looking at the anxieties of society and just all the things that can come out of the woodwork from that. And it was just it was eye-opening. And I'm more of a science fiction fan than I am a horror fan, but sure. I definitely really appreciate a really good horror book, and there's such a good variety of them out there now that I really love looking for really good ones.
Yeah, I didn't really grow up too much as a horror fan either, but as Stephanie was talking about Goosebumps, definitely read a bunch of Goosebumps, and I went into Fear Street a little bit when I was a little bit older. And we're going to be talking about this throughout the conversation today, but I feel like horror is another genre where it really crosses over a lot of genres. There's a lot of blending of the genres that we're going to be talking about in a little bit. But because, Andrew, you were just talking about, too, taking a Gothic lit course in college, because horror has come a long way since the classics that we know, Dracula, Frankenstein, which is also sort of a cross-genre there, and a lot of Gothic ghost stories. How do you think this genre has evolved over time?
I mean, it's a survivor. I mean, there's no shortage of things to be scared of and to be frightened by. And I think that's sort of the key to its longevity, is that people have really creative ways of teasing out what are the things that we're anxious and scared of in society and the world around us. And that can go from anything from, during the spiritualism era, like of ghosts and things from beyond, to the horrors of the Cold War and zombies, and like what are computers doing to our brains. There's just you turn over a rock and there's something that there's something that could be frightening underneath it. And I think that's never going to stop. We're always going to be sort of the scared apes around the campfire with the darkness all around us. So I think I don't think horror is going to go anywhere because of that.
Right, and I think as we see, not only is it not going anywhere, it's kind of blending into so many different genres, and it's really, I think, for each genre that we talk about, whether it's horror or not, it's hard to really pin down just one subject or one genre for each book or each story. And as you all know, we've covered many genres of literature here on Where We Live. And later this hour, we're going to be hearing from an author who writes paranormal romance. So, Andrew, curious to hear from your perspective, too, in terms of how horror is also crossing genres into romance itself.
I mean, genres are fluid things. I mean, it's very, very difficult to stick a strict boundary around something and say this is that one thing. Right. There's always exceptions and stuff like that. I think I'm not much of a horror or paranormal reader or paranormal romance person, but it's been around for a long time. There's certainly people who've built entire careers off of this sort of thing. More recently, I've been seeing that there's a lot more sort of like coziest romances, and ones that have sort of a horror theme. And when you mentioned that, I picked up a book off the shelf. I've got a friend of mine here in Vermont who wrote a romance called Haunt Your Heart Out, and it's basically about a woman returning home to open a bookstore, and it happens to be haunted. So all the different elements that make up horror, they can be sort of transplanted into other books and used alongside all those other tropes, and to really great effect.
Love a good haunted house or haunted bookstore story. So if you have any recommendations, please let us know. And Stephanie, because so many book recommendations that you've been making and also talking to so many authors, are you seeing more diversity in this genre with a deeper exploration in different areas of horror to also a diversity of authors exploring different scary things from different cultures?
Absolutely. I mean, even a change from since I started the podcast in 2017, I was always making sure that the recommendations we gave were diverse. And I feel like now when we make episodes, we do it without thinking because there is truly such a plethora of authors and stories. There's so many great horror stories being written by women now about the female experience, really getting into female rage, and all kinds of Indigenous authors, Black authors. I recently did an episode for Latina Heritage Month that went like over an hour, just full of recommendations.
And we would love to hear from our listeners too in terms of recommendations. Let us know if you have any horror, thriller, sci-fi, or paranormal favorites that you would like us to know. 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You can also email us at wherewelive@ctpublic.org. And Stephanie, as we talk about horror and how it's evolved, since the dawn of time, are we seeing it being elevated as a genre? And I think the phrase elevated horror is also a thing now, right?
It is a thing. And I know people in the horror community have feelings about it.
Sure.
It was a term being used to describe kind of the art house films that came out,
Right.
Like the A24, like Hereditary, and Get Out. And these were horror films that were getting prestige. And it kind of felt like people were finally okay saying they liked a horror movie. And so I think horror fans were like, it's all been horror. Like it's always been here. But with that prestige comes more interest in the genre. And so that's brought new eyes. But I mean, yeah, it's always changing and evolving. And a lot of people say, horror is always the same tropes. Like it's always the haunted house. It's always the vampire. And it's not. These are tools. And I am seeing so many people take these tropes and mold them into different ways. Rachel Harrison recently put out Play Nice this year, which I loved. And that's a haunted house story about a possessed house, which I had never seen. That's a new spin on it. With the slasher, Stephen Graham Jones is the master at that. And he wrote, I Was a Teenage Slasher, which is a POV from the slasher. But at the end of the story, you feel for him. Like, how does that work? How do you do that?
I think it's really interesting because we're going to have an author on in a little bit where we talked about how there's a sort of not necessarily resurgence, but as you were saying, the sort of the elevation of genres because we've had this very similar conversation about the romance genre and how romantasy is so big now, and it's sort of taking it back in some ways and to make it air quotes legitimate. And when we're thinking about horror, Stephanie, do you think we're seeing more and more of the genre being used to explore our real life fears and current everyday horrors? And I know that's something that has always been the case historically, but perhaps in a more open way or, less underlining perhaps?
Like you were saying, horror has always been a tool to reflect our anxieties of the time. But I mean, absolutely, like I was saying, a rise in stories about a female rage, which I think goes hand in hand with attacks on bodily autonomy. Like everything is a response to the things going on now.
And I want to bring into the conversation Jane Franco. She's a librarian at the Warehouse Point Library in East Windsor, also the author of a new short story called The Android, which was published in the 2025 Connecticut Literary Anthology. So Jane, we'll love to hear more about your short story because it sounds like you were inspired to write this story based on some real life fears that's happening right now.
Yeah, definitely. Just everything with tech and AI. I was watching a lot of documentaries about where things are going and seeing people interact with the robots and things that aren't real. So that really inspired my story, which is about a husband and wife. And the husband gets an android version of his wife, but 20 years younger. And as revenge, she does the same thing, but ends up falling in love with him. And I think I was really trying to explore like what humanity is and what makes people real and emotions real.
Well, and I love that your story is specific to technology because that has always been part of the genre, I think. And AI is, of course, a huge topic of conversation right now. Can you talk about techno horror as a genre and what made you interested in exploring it deeper?
Yeah, I think it's becoming, more and more popular because AI is changing so fast. And I started watching a lot of TikToks on on robots and what they're doing and how they're evolving. And it's really scary because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. Like there are all these predictions, but no one's really sure. And I think that's always really fascinated me. And also, I think when people are using like the animals now, like the fake animals, as like comfort for people, that's fascinating. And I'm always struggling with that idea of if it's a good thing or not. So,
well, and curious to hear, especially your process of you doing all the research and sort of thinking about your own fears. And earlier we heard Stephanie describe how reading horror has helped her process her fears. Has writing about it helped you process some of your anxiety about what's happening in the world?
Definitely. I think that's the main reason I do it. Usually I'm fascinated and terrified of something that I learn about. And I definitely process it through writing about it. And I also kind of want to get the message out about certain things, like how scary it is and that we need to be thinking about it, like as a society.
Well, and Andrew, we'd love to get your response too in terms of the idea of techno horror and what are your thoughts about that becoming a genre, or not becoming a genre, but becoming more well known?
I think there's always been a level of anxiety around technology because it's change, right? It's something that upends how we've done things in the past, and it's something that's like new. So we don't know really what's going to happen when we get the next new shiny thing. So like right now we're in the if you go back to like 60s, 70s. There's a really great short story by Harlan Ellison called "I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream," and it's about a bunch of people who are being tortured by this malevolent artificial intelligence. And this is sort of at the dawn of the computer age, where computers were large and fit inside big rooms. And I reread it recently, and it really holds up pretty well because it's he's tapping into some of like the same sort of anxieties we have about AI, and it's this new thing that we don't know and we can't control, and we just our imagination can sort of run away with us on it. So because we don't know what's going to happen with it. So that's how I sort of look at stuff that involves technology and horror. The Channel 4 and Netflix series Black Mirror is a really good example of this, because it's really tapping into the heartbeat of the moment of what types of things technology is doing to upend society and upend how we do things. So whether that's creating a person out of someone's tweets and internet search history, or robots that run amok or getting sucked into computer simulations. These are all things that we feel that maybe could be plausible and are pretty frightening.
Well, we're going to continue exploring how frightening the horror fiction and genre can be in the next two segments. With us is Andrew Liptek, author of the newsletter Transfer Orbit. We also have Stephanie Gagne, who's the host of Books in the Freezer podcast, and also Jane Frankel, who's the author and librarian at the Warehouse Point Library in East Windsor. And listeners, let us know if you have a book recommendation or any thoughts about the horror genre. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. If you're looking for a horror read to carry you through the rest of the spooky season, you've come to the right place. Today, we're talking spooky books and horror, from paranormal romance and techno-horror to classic ghost stories. Horror knows no bounds. Joining us now is A.K. Nevermore, president of the Connecticut Romance Writers Association and author living here in Connecticut. Her new book is Wares and Witchery, a spicy small-town paranormal romance. A.K., welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
Of course, and we still have Jane Franco, Andrew Liptek, and Stephanie Gagne with us for this conversation. And listeners, let us know if you have any book recs or any questions, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So AK, we're so excited to have you back on the show. Tell us about your new book, because it's not your first paranormal horror romance, but it's a little bit of a departure from what you normally write.
It definitely is. My normal is more like dystopian science fiction romance. I do paranormal romance as well. And this one is a little bit different because it's kind of a softer type of scary book, I guess. And it's small town, which I have not delved into before, but it was definitely fun.
Mm. And so what made you want to explore the small town paranormal romance? Like, was there something about it that made you want to jump into it?
Actually, it was a weird call that was for an anthology, and it just kind of spun out of control and decided that it needed to be a book instead of a short story. So that was kind of it. And it seems like there's been kind of a resurgence in interest in small town things. Mm-hmm. I am very used to writing more of the epic kind of, long series, and doing a shorter standalone kind of book was a challenge, and I all for it.
Right. I love the idea of things happening in small towns. I'm a big Agatha Christie fan, and I always question, how do these things all happen in these small places? Should we go to these places? And the fact that they're called cozy mysteries as well kind of cracks me up. And you also dedicated this book to everyone who was hanging out in the shadows during those high school cake parties. I see you. Cheers. Mm-hmm. Love that. Can you tell us a bit about this dedication?
Yeah, it was pretty much the main character is very much an outsider in a small town that she grew up in. And I think that we all kind of have that, that part of us that belongs but doesn't really belong. And, we weren't one of the people standing around, the popular group type kind of thing. And it really just speaks to her character and kind of everyone who was in that same situation.
Well, I want to ask more about the sort of the reemergence of the small town story idea. And like we've explored throughout this hour, horror is really crossing over so many genres and so many spheres, and even into romance, as we're talking about right now. And it's not really something that I think maybe people might not think these genres pair well together, because you're putting together love and fear, but it's actually kind of a perfect match.
Yeah, they definitely are really great foils for each other. And, when you think about romance, there's always an issue, right? There's something that needs to be overcome. And that is either, an internal factor or an external factor, just like in every other story. And, when you pair it together of something really scary happening on the outside with this desire to kind of connect with people, it definitely, it turns into kind of a pressure cooker, which works really well for literature.
Well, and Stephanie, I'm curious to hear from you too, especially all the conversations you've been having, this idea of pairing love and fear together. It feels, I think when you look at it on paper, it feels different, but when you're reading it or consuming the media, it makes so much sense, because I'm thinking things like True Blood, Twilight, these are all genres that pair them so well together. And clearly we love it because it's all over the place.
I mean, it is. It's a horror romance for sure. And no, I mean, it definitely makes a good pairing. Isabel Cañas is doing like really good work in like the horror romance sphere of things. And I don't know, I do feel that horror and romance are sister genres.
Well, I would think like Dracula also has essence of it. right?
Absolutely. Going back to the Gothic roots of it all for sure.
And AK, back to the spicy romance genre, because you openly talk about writing spicy romance or smut, as you've called it before. Could you talk about how this type of writing into sexual erotica pairs with horror and the paranormal?
It pairs really well. And I mean, it's done amazing. You know, you've got like the Haunting Adelines out there that people are just crazy about. And it's, I don't know. I think that it just kind of speaks to readers on a visceral level where, you know, like Stephanie was saying before about this is how to experience this in a safe way where, you know, maybe you're afraid of it, but you're not really sure, you know, and it's the same thing with these kinds of relationships where, you know, it's definitely a vicarious type of read.
And do you have any paranormal romance or romance horror books to recommend for us?
Well, Haunting Adeline is definitely one. One that I have not read, but I've heard amazing things about is Mexican Gothic. It's supposed to be really, really good. But yeah, there's a bunch. I mean, if you just type in, you know, horror romance, you get lists of these things.
I did read Mexican Gothic a couple of years ago, and definitely would recommend that to friends who would like to get into the genre. And Stephanie, as we touched on earlier, paranormal romance has really become super popular. And it reminded of our team. We have a lot of millennials on our team, including myself, of great paranormal pop culture that we grew up with. And we mentioned Twilight earlier, but also Buffy the Vampire Slayer, X-Files, Charmed. So how do you think pop culture influenced our horror and specifically romance and horror, sort of our love for it?
I mean, I'm going to go way back and say my first paranormal romance love story I saw was Casper.
Oh, yes. We cannot forget about Casper.
No. I had us all falling in love with Ghost Devon Sawa. So I think that for me was an important pop culture moment. And I mean, I talked to a lot of authors on the podcast, and we are constantly pulling from the culture and the art that we grew up with. So I think it makes sense that for millennials now growing up and making our own art, that it would be heavily influenced by the stuff we grew up with at the time.
Well, Andrew, we'd love to hear from you here too, in terms of, you know, how much of our love for this genre today is influenced by what's out there, what's in pop culture.
I think there's quite a bit. I just literally last night I finished Joe Hill's new book, King's Sorrow, which is he's called it his dragon book, and it's about 6 friends who summon a dragon after one of them is threatened by a drug dealer. And they basically he sort of traps them in this deal to every Easter they have to pick somebody to kill, or he'll pick one of them off. And that book is littered with references to all sorts of things. That's something that if you haven't read any of Joe Hill's stuff, he's really good at doing that. He sort of calls back to everything from Puff the Magic Dragon to Smaug from The Hobbit, and really sort of winds King, the Legend of King Arthur, and he's done that in other books. I'm trying to think, like I want to say his novel Horns, his first novel Horns. He weaves a lot of musical imagery into it and sort of calls back to music. No, sorry, that was his second novel. Heart-Shaped Box. He does the same thing. So he sort of blends a lot of this stuff in a way that really it doesn't feel forced or extraneous, I guess. Just to jump back for a second on paranormal romance. One book that I would recommend is Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Canas. That was one that really drew me in, and it has a lot to do with it's set during the American-Mexican War, and she has a really neat take on vampires, and as it turns out, they are not the real monsters of the story. It has a lot to do with sort of colonization and settlement, which I really appreciated, and it's got a really great romance nestled at the heart of it.
Well, that one's actually on my to be read, so pushing that up. And I also have not read much of Joe Hill, so adding that as well to my black hole of a to be read list. And Jane, I would love to hear from you too, because as an author and also librarian, what are you seeing in both spaces? Or maybe we can talk about the library since we haven't touched on that yet. What are you seeing from your clients, if you will, what they're checking out, or any specific genres within the genres that they're really into right now?
Um, Good question. I think definitely like horror is huge, of course. I was a children's librarian for a long time, so I definitely saw an uptick in horror and science fiction for kids, and how much they love it. I feel like it didn't have that impact before, but there are so many good books now, even for really little kids, like the Creepy Carrots series. You can, so I think there's definitely a bigger interest in that.
And for our listeners, we will have a list of these books for you available on ctpublic.org/where we live after the show. And AK, we've been talking about book recommendations for listeners who might be interested in delving into the genre. Do you have any specific recommendations for aspiring authors who want to give this a go?
I'm not quite sure what you mean.
Like book recommendations for authors who want to try to write these genres, or is it the same list essentially?
It would really be the same list. I mean, if the biggest kind of recommendation is if you are trying to write something, you should read it. And you should read what's been published within the past 5 years. I know a lot of authors, aspiring authors, fall into the trap where, it's what they've read when they were kids. And the market has changed quite a bit. And if you write a book like The Hobbit and you try to sell it in today's market, it's not going to go anywhere because people aren't interested in pages of trees.
Right.
So you really have to keep current with your recommendations and what you're kind of modeling your writing after.
Yeah, unless you're like me who do enjoy descriptions of trees. But as an adult, though, I love that as an example because as a kid, did not really take to The Hobbit, but as an adult, love it so much. So things do change. And we will be continuing this conversation after a quick break. Staying with us is A.K. Nevermore, who's the president of the Connecticut chapter of Romance Writers of America and also an author living here in Connecticut. And Andrew Liptek, who's the author of the newsletter Transfer Orbit. Stephanie Gagne, host of the Books in the Freezer podcast, and Jane Franco, who's an author and librarian in East Windsor. And let us know if you have a question for our panel or if you have a favorite horror book that you would like to share. Love to hear from you. 888-720-9677 or drop us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we've been exploring the horror genre from apocalyptic fiction to sci-fi to psychological horror. And if you have a favorite horror, sci-fi thriller, or paranormal story that you would like to share with us, give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, AK, we finished off the conversation earlier by asking some recommendations for aspiring authors who want to try writing paranormal. Could you share a bit about your own writing process? Because with horror, I imagine you have to do a lot more or a different kind of world building along with crafting the story.
Yes and no. I think that, especially with horror or with like a gothic type of novel, it's very important to set atmosphere. And that's definitely different than maybe, a rom-com. So there are certain word choices and phrases and, tropes that would definitely have to be brought to the forefront when you're writing something like that. And, a lot of the kind of research would be that going in and doing the pop culture thing, watching the movies. What do you see? What are kind of the expectations for a haunted house or that kind of thing? And then going in and doing research like on the Amityville Horror or something and, kind of getting the quote unquote real life things that go that. I know I watched a bunch of different, they have those ghost shows where you go in and, you kind of, they walk around with the different things. And
Right.
that's always interesting because when you're watching something like that, kind of like real life, or what was it, the Blair Witch Project,
Right.
things like that, where you're seeing how people are reacting to these kind of things, and then you can fold them into your own writing. So it's that kind of thing, I think.
Well, Blair Witch Project actually made me a little nauseous because of all the motion that was happening. So I would love to find a way to revisit that and actually get in the story. But sort of along those lines, Andrew, we've seen a lot of evolution in this genre over the years, and this is a space that you're familiar with. Is there anything that surprised you over the years, or are you not surprised by how it has really evolved?
I've been excuse me. I don't think I've been really surprised at how it's evolved. As I said earlier, horror has really endured. I think that it's just a real testament of horror authors to just keep thinking up of new ways to scare the crap out of us. And there are a lot of people who are doing some innovative stuff. So I've got a sort of a stack of books here. Paul Tremblay, who's based out of Massachusetts, wrote a really great book called Horror Movie, which is sort of a take on on Hollywood, but it's about there was a sort of a found footage horror movie that had been started to be filmed, but some horrible things had happened to the cast and crew. And now a major studio is trying to reboot it, and now horrible things are happening again. That's a book that I don't really think would exist without sort of the environment of Hollywood as it stands right now, with
Right.
Reboots and stuff. So, I mean, you could read it on its own, and you'll get it, but it's definitely not something that I think could have been published maybe 10 or 15 years ago. There's also been like a really big move. Not a big move. There's been a lot of really prominent books that have come out recently from Black authors. Connecticut's P. Djeli Clark wrote a really great book called Ring Shout. It's a short. It's basically set during the Reconstruction era, or sorry, not after Reconstruction, 1920s, with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And it really, that's sort of central to the plot. And we're starting to see a lot more of that sort of, Black-centered stories. The Reformatory by Tanner Tarif Dew and is one I haven't read yet, but I've heard really good things. And then Jordan Peele and teamed up with an anthologist named John Joseph Adams to write Out There Screaming, which is an anthology of all Black horror stories. And there's some really great ones in there as well. And then there's a new one that came out this year called The Buffalo Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones, which is all about it's a really neat take on the vampire, and it sort of it's a Native American story, and that one had me at the edge of my seat. So I think there's a real lean into identity. I think partially because of how the publishing industry has changed and is starting to really embrace these stories a bit more. And there's just a wealth of talent who are producing these stories. So I think that maybe not the stories themselves are really surprising me, but I think it's really great that we're seeing horror branch out to really explore a much wider range of identities, a much wider range of stories, and really either leaning into folklore, leaning into history, or leaning into identity to really tap and find new stories.
And what actually, Stephanie, this echoes to something that you said earlier with seeing more folklore and more indigenous storytelling in your own conversations on your podcast. I think sort of framing the same question to you, was there anything that surprised you as you're having these conversations in terms of what's becoming popular or what is popular or what are people loving right now?
Yeah, not really surprised. Yeah, I do feel like there is a change every now and then with like what rises to the top. I've noticed a big uptick in slasher narratives, which has been really fun as a lifelong slasher person myself. And I think it's one of those genres that people think like, what can you possibly do with that? It's someone just going out here stabbing. And like Stephen Graham Jones, that was mentioned earlier, someone who is also a giant slasher fan and has really reinvented that. And speaking to what we were talking about earlier with getting inspiration from pop culture, I had mentioned Play Nice by Rachel Harrison, which is about an influencer who inherits her estranged mother's house. And her mother lost custody of all her daughters and ended up writing kind of an Amityville horror type story about the house being possessed. And Rachel was very inspired by the Y2K aughts coverage of figures like Britney Spears. And so it is questioning that like women are crazy narrative that we're told. So just is interesting to see all the ways that authors are using these tools and tropes to tell new things in interesting and refreshing ways.
Well, because we're giving a lot of recommendations for our listeners today, we'll love to have you give us some book recommendations based on how you rate books on your podcast, Books in the Freezer. So with the room temperature in the fridge and in the freezer, do you have recommendations that you can give to us for each category?
Of course. Starting off with room temperature, I want to go with a slasher I read recently that I had a lot of fun with called Breathe In, Bleed Out by Brian McCauley, which is set at a wellness yoga retreat.
I love it.
And it's a woman who's like just gotten over this breakup, and her friends all kind of get together and they're like, hey, we'll all do this together. You need a change of pace. And of course, they start getting picked off one by one. But it is also a look at like the appropriative nature of wellness culture. And I think has a lot of smart things to say and is also like a fun read. A fridge book, I would say, My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix, which is a young adult horror book about these two girls in suburban South Carolina in the 1980s that are having fun one night, and then they go off into the woods, and one of the friends comes back acting real strange. And the one friend is convinced that her friend has been possessed by a demon. And it's about her just trying to convince someone that this is the case, and no one believes her. But it also manages to be a beautiful story about friendship and demon possession in the 80s. A book I would put straight in the freezer would be The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim. And I've also seen a rise in kind of, I was saying female rage, but like good for her narratives where we are really cheering on women getting to be villainous and have a dissent. And this is about a woman whose parents have recently split up, and her Korean parents split up. Her mom is giving them dinner and giving them this fish and offers her the eye. And she eats the fish eye, and it just begins this obsession with eyes. Her mom brings home this boyfriend, and our main character just becomes obsessed with his blue eyes and the idea of consuming them and the spiral that it takes her down.
So many different spirals. So thanks for letting us get an idea of what all three categories look like. I think we just added more books to our list, which is the goal here. And I know we've been talking a lot about the horrors that we all enjoy, but I'm actually really curious too. Are there any types of horror that you do not like? I see Jane, you're nodding. So let's start with Jane and we'll go around the table here.
Yeah, I really hate body horror.
Okay. Why is that?
I don't know. It's something about probably control. Like, if you have a story like where you're running from a killer or something like that, there's always a chance that the main character can win. And I think, that's what I'm always rooting for them to kind of overcome whatever they're going through. But with body horror, it's just about like, it's awful.
Right.
I can't imagine like that happening to someone. It's just so terrible. I feel like it's not something I want to read about.
Right. Something with less control. Andrew, what about yourself? Is there a horror genre that you are really not into?
I'd have to say body horror is another one that really gives me an ick. It's the idea of being transformed into something sort of against your will, into something is just not something I mean, there are some stories I really like that involve it. Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation is one. A science fiction series called The Expanse, Leviathan Wakes, has some elements of that in its first book, which it's like one of those things that it's horrifying, but you just can't look away.
Right.
And I try to maybe limit the number of times I find those to look away. Eyes is another thing. So Eyes Are the Best Part is one I am steering well clear of. I have no desire to read that one, although I've heard good things.
Right, as Stephanie is laughing. And as you're describing it, Andrew, I was thinking about Kafka's Metamorphosis. Not exactly a horror fiction, but if I woke up and turned into a cockroach, I don't think that's my ideal way to start the day. So I think my colleagues would actually be icky about that. AK, what about yourself? Any horrors that you don't like?
Yeah, I mean, body horror is not my favorite.
Okay, so we got several votes for body horror right now.
But as far as everything else, it really depends, I think, on how it's portrayed too. Like, I mean, you can write anything well and you can write anything really poorly. And if it's done well, then yeah, I'll read it.
Yeah, I feel the same way too. You know, if you all recommend it to me, I will most likely pick it up. And whether or not I like it, I either will let you know or keep it to myself. So, and really quickly here, Stephanie, any horrors that you do not like?
I would have to say probably Cosmic is one I don't tend to get along with. I think it just ends up being a little vague, and I leave feeling kind of underwhelmed.
Okay, cosmic horror. All right, we're adding that to the things to think about today. And we've gone through so much, and I kind of want to go through a lightning round. We got about a minute left, but if there is one horror book that you can recommend to someone who has never read it or is interested in wanting to explore their horizons, which one would you pick? AK, we'll go with you first.
I would do Catriona Ward's Last House on Needless Street or Shirley Jackson's Haunting of House Hill. Hill House, sorry.
Andrew.
I have to go with what I've read recently. Joe Hill's King Sorrow is just as I said, I finished it last night and it's still in my head, but it's really a great read. I really enjoyed it.
And Jane, maybe an adult and a children's recommendation from you.
Yeah, the Feed series by Mira Grant for the adults, and The Night Gardener by Jonathan Auxier for children. It's a great one.
And Stephanie, last but not least, a recommendation for someone who wants to give this genre a try.
I would suggest When the Wolf Comes Home by Nat Cassidy. It's a very fun-paced ode to like the action movies of the 80s, while also being like a meditation on fear.
Well, so much to read, so much meditating on fear we're going to be doing. We want to thank our guests today. You've been listening to Stephanie Gagne, who's the host of the Books in the Freezer podcast. Stephanie, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And also AK Nevermore, who's the president of the Connecticut chapter of Romance Writers of America and author living here in Connecticut. AK, appreciate you coming back. And also Andrew Liptek, who's the author of the newsletter Transfer Orbit. Thank you so much, Andrew, for being back as well.
Thank you so much.
And Jane Franco, who's the author and librarian at the Warehouse Point Library in East Windsor. Jane, we appreciate your time as well.
Thanks so much.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you all so much for listening, and happy horror reading, everyone.